Welcome, everyone, to the Clocking Out podcast, the show about people who share their own personal journey that include making bold choices to clock out of situations, to follow their dreams of career fulfillment, and to live their best, most authentic lives. I'm your host, Raymond Lee, and this podcast could not be possible without the support of Career Minds. More about Career Minds after the show. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Dan Young. Dan is a fractional chief marketing officer, an educator, he's a brand amplifier, and entrepreneur. Dan is driven by a mission to empower individuals and organizations through innovative solutions and impactful social change. His diverse professional journey encompasses a variety of ventures that reflect a commitment to integrity, education, innovation, and empowerment. Dan comes from 4 generations of successful professionals, and he opens up and shares his candid struggles to pursue his own professional identity. He has a bachelor's degree in business and marketing with an MBA in marketing and finance from the University of Delaware, with a doctorate degree from Temple University in social and behavioral marketing. Dan and I recently uncovered in our initial meeting just a week ago that we share some interesting connections that we explore today that date back over a year ago, where we were in the same room together but didn't know it at the time. So I'm really excited to share his journey. So without further ado, please enjoy Dr. Dan Young and his clocking out story. Dan, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Raymond. Good to see you too.
So I want to first say that I think the universe works in mysterious ways, because you and I had our first conversation a week ago on Monday, and we connected through a mutual friend. And what's really interesting is for the last 20 years, we've lived just minutes from one another. We've been connected to the same entrepreneurial community here in Wilmington, Delaware.
Mm-hmm.
And most oddly, while we've actually never met in person, you and I attended a funeral for a mutual friend over 9 years ago. And
That's
we
right.
were at that same event.
Yeah,
And we just discovered that a week ago.
absolutely.
Isn't that crazy?
First of all, that's a very kind of Delaware story, where everyone there are 2 degrees of separation from everyone, including the president of the United States. But yeah, I think it just goes to show a couple things: A, kind of the community nature of where we live, and B, the fact that birds of a feather fly together, right? So you're probably going to be around the same type of people if you are a person of a certain character, a certain standard. It is very serendipitous that we have this conversation today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to eventually for us meeting in person.
Absolutely.
And I think it's fitting to say that the mutual friend that we had is a very prominent investor in Delaware and in the Northeast community, David Freshman. And I was looking up how long it's actually been, and it's been March 17th, 2015 is when he unexpectedly passed at the age of 52. And it's over 9 years ago. And what was kind of chilling for me is that I turned 52 2 weeks ago. And it was sort of a reminder for me that life is short and you never really know how long you have on this earth. And it was just, it was nice to reflect back on David's life and the contributions that he's made in the investment community, but just wanted to share that connection and what an impact that he had on both of our lives.
Well, sure. David, I first met him when he was in his early 30s. He came to talk to my accounting class at the University of Delaware. I was just taken by kind of the level of a swagger and confidence that he brought to someone who was an accountant, which I never thought about. And so we had the opportunity to exchange information, and he was always very good about saying, anytime that you need to talk, let me know. And then he, then looped me in on a number of different projects, mainly as someone who could teach those who were pitching how to use actual marketing practice
Mm,
to pitch. Most recently at Fashion Vest, as we talked about before.
yeah.
So yes, he certainly missed. I see his wife Robin at our local dining club almost every other week, and follow what his children are doing, both doing great things. So he's true testament to real hard work and family values here in the community of Delaware.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I'd like to first jump in, Dan, as I always do for our listeners, with an introduction to who you are, and would love for you to share where'd you grow up, maybe tell us a little bit about your family, your parents, siblings that you have, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm a fourth generation from Wilmington, Delaware. So anyone who's not quite sure where where that is, it's literally 25 minutes south of Philadelphia. So I'm a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder, and it only takes, well, if there's no traffic, 25 minutes to get to the stadium. If there is traffic, usually an hour and a half to get to the stadium. My family has been in Delaware, obviously, for four generations. My great grandfather was a foreman on the Pennsylvania Railroad. In fact, what's kind of fun is the office that I'm talking to you here right now is the same building that he worked out of, right next to the Wilmington train station, which is
Wow.
pretty incredible. And I didn't know that until I did some research. He was very educated, especially for that time. He went to the University of Pennsylvania. At least the railroad sent him to Penn to learn Italian because they wanted him to manage both the black workers on the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Italian immigrants that were working on the railroad. So that really started my family's really deep belief in education. My grandfather grew up, and he went to Penn for his master's degree in education, and he ended up being the first black principal in the state of Delaware. My father, full scholarship to Harvard, came out. He worked with, at that time, Governor Pete DuPont as his personnel director. And those of you who follow business, if not Delaware business, the banking system was a major driver of Delaware's economic development in the 1980s. And so he was kind of in front and center and observing those different changes. And then he went on to head the human resources department in Wilmington Trust Bank, which was at the time the largest bank in Delaware. Uh, and then there's me. And so I grew up here. Enjoyed a lot of the aspects of growing up with a family that was relatively well known. um, I don't know if I'd call us well off, but we certainly didn't think much about budgeting whenever we did anything. But also, it could be a little bit lonely just because we were at the time, if you're talking about the early '80s, the only African American family within like 2 or 3 miles of where we grew up.
Mm.
Uh, and I only say that because I knew the other two. so um, so grew up with just a lot of kind of insecurities about my who I was, what my role was in society, um, and also was growing up with, at the time I didn't realize it, learning disability, the ADHD and dyslexia. I ended up being diagnosed my first year at the University of Delaware, which is where I went undergrad and grad school. And really just made a deal with myself that I would try to get to the highest level of education possible, which was also something I told my grandfather I would do before he passed away.
Well, Dan, I love your story. And, when I think about growing up where it's four generations of, just very motivated, sounds like, lots of dreams. And I just wonder, when you look back at your father, grandfather, great grandfather, And you talked a little bit about, looking up to them and really wanting to have education be a primary focus for you based on how they've impacted you. I wonder if each generation had that same sort of pressure. If was there not so much a pressure, but was there a desire that it's like from your great grandfather to your grandfather who was the first black principal to your dad who went to Harvard. It was almost like a generational of overachievers to some degree. And now it's you. You said it's me. And it's sort of like, what kind of pressure did you feel when three generations of very successful individuals in their career? And I just wonder, with some of that pressure and just sort of how did that feel as you kind of thought about your career and sort of your identity as a person? I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Um, it was a lot of pressure. I think that when I think back as being a younger person, I was very insecure and felt a lot of depression because I felt as though I couldn't kind of keep up, especially with some of the learning disability
Mm,
issues. What's interesting is like I just told you one branch of the tree, which is funny.
right.
My grandfather's sister, Catherine, was the first black graduate of a University of Delaware graduate program.
Mm,
Their brother Joseph, was the first black member of the United Nations. So we very much had one of these families that it was common practice to kind of look at my generation and say, okay, so like who's up next, right? Like what are you guys gonna do? And when you layer that on top of like a young person growing up in a neighborhood where no one looks like him and whatever he was doing at the time, it wasn't necessarily that special to them. Layer that on top of some issues with neurodiversity. Layer that on top of at any given time I was about 50 pounds overweight from the other kids. It felt like a lot of pressure. Now as I got old, I come from obviously the generation. We're in the same
hmm
generation, right? And oftentimes our dads were in the generation where they weren't going to kind of sit down with you and like lay out how they felt
Right.
about stuff. So I think it was only after I was older and had lunch with my dad, and he said something along the lines of, "Yeah, I remember that my father, in essence my grandfather, would like laden me with all this praise and embarrassed me, and I wasn't going to do that with you." And I'm thinking, yeah, I could have used some of that, bro. Like, like I never knew where I stood in our family or in our life because of that. And so I felt a ton of pressure, and it's a very, no matter whether you're black or not, there's that great parable that says, you know, hard times create strong men. Strong men create easy times. Easy times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. And then the cycle goes over and over and
Mm.
over.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing how much pressure it was and the impact that it had on you as it relates to depression and things that you had to deal with, particularly with the challenges you had with your learning disabilities. And I think that people that are listening who are, whether they have kids or they're trying to relate to why they've chosen a field that they've chosen, I think your story is a great example of how the pressure of your parents and your aunts and uncles and your family plays into the decisions that you make when you're thinking about your career. And And it's so interesting. And I wonder if you can share, when was the moment when you realized that Dan Young's identity is your identity, and you sort of, that pressure that you were experiencing started to subside in a way that you started to feel like, I am who I am, and I am the driver of my career and my life. And I wonder if you can share, when was that moment?
Wow. Yeah. Um, I think that my first child was born in
Mm,
2006. My grandfather passed away in 2005, so almost 20 years from now, 19 years, almost
mm,
exactly to this date. I think that, as most people say, energy is neither created nor destroyed; it's just transferred. I feel like he was always a very, very big cheerleader of mine, in terms of, hey, I believe in you, I love you regardless of what you do, like, you're the greatest. But like, he's an awesome cheerleader, greatest cheerleader ever. And almost feel as though, when he passed, obviously it was like saddest moment of my life, but at the same time, I almost felt like now it's my turn to be my own person, because I don't necessarily have him as a crutch to be my own
mm,
cheerleader. Like, I think the first job I took out of school, I became a financial advisor, mainly because it was available, but also keep in mind, my dad was HR at a bank, and he basically said, "Hey, listen, man, like, you have good grades. I work here. You can have any job you want." And I basically said something along the lines of, I want to keep the shaved head. I want to keep the hoop earring. This is back in the '90s. I would rather just kind of do my own thing, where people are working with me to work with
mm,
me. But at the same time, that job was very much a job that was there to impress my dad. I think when my grandfather passed away, it was the first time I started reflecting on the different aspects of my life that were put in place to impress my father. And I think I started to slowly peel back some of that onion, and really and rethink what I was doing, how I was doing it, why I was doing it. And I think from that point on, from being like about, almost 29-ish, about that point, I really started to think hard about, what are those building blocks of my life that I need to start to peel back and say, is this it? Is this it? Is this it? And that led to like probably a 5-6 year time frame, where I sold my financial planning practice, and I did some things that were like out of the ordinary, took some risks. I went on some
mm,
trips, I went overseas to, did some vacations, um, you know all these interesting things that were not rank and file with what my parents wanted me to do. My dad, when I becoming a financial advisor, which, as most of your audience knows, basically means you sell
yeah.
products. And this was in like 1999. My dad's question was like, "Why would you want to do that when you could just be in an office, just work? Like, why would you want to be a salesperson?" Which kind of gives an idea of his thoughts process on that. And I basically said, I just kind of want to make my own path, but I also want to make my path in the way that
Mm,
makes you proud. If I was real with myself, I probably would have gone to a bigger city. I probably would have done something more in like creative arts. I probably would have, done something very different, because that was still put in place there to think, what is the closest thing to what my dad does that I'm okay doing, but that will impress my dad. So I really think that after my grandfather passed away, I really started to think much more about my role, not only in my family, but in this world, and the space that I wanted to take up, you know, and what were going to be the things that I feel as though I could really be the best at. And those things that I don't think, basic Jack Welch GE logic, right? If we can't be number one or two or something,
mm,
we're not going to do it. So I think I really started to take that logic and say, what can I really be the best at here? And then really start to focus
Oh,
on
I
those
love
different
that.
things.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like the sort of the idea of clocking out, it's almost like your identity was really taking shape during your first job as a financial advisor. And I know that you went to your undergrad at University of Delaware. You got your MBA there with a specialization in marketing. And I just wonder, how did you get to it ultimately you're practicing your work today. But I just wonder, first of all, love the fact that you were a financial advisor and went right into sales mode, worked at that for over 11 years, sold it right before the financial crisis or maybe during the financial crisis, which is interesting timing. But how did you go from MBA, marketing specialization, and then as a financial advisor for almost a decade, and then deciding that you're selling it? Like, I just wonder what that transition was like.
Huh. Well, that's a really interesting story. So when I went on to Monster.com in 1999 to look for a job, and I looked up finance and marketing because
Mm,
I had a dual concentration. The only job listed on market on that was the job of a financial advisor, because that's the only job that's always hiring. Because you're basically able to work commission, it didn't really matter that much if you failed. So they were always marketing for that job. So that got me in to that position at the time at what was then American Express Financial
mm,
Advisors, is now Ameriprise. And I found that I really enjoyed doing seminars. And so I linked up, because I had this rapport with a college professor who ran my master's, who was my my teacher during the master's program. I just started reaching out to schools to see about doing retirement planning workshops for college professors. And I found that I really enjoyed speaking to people after a few times where I
hmm
was, super scared. And after doing that, I found that bringing on clients was really easy. Like, people heard me speak and they wanted to come work with me. And so that led to a long career, which ended up in me selling my practice when I was 35, and a lot of fun. And I think that it's very interesting how you kind of fall into things. Probably, I was, of anyone I know, probably a good candidate for a liberal arts type of education, that kind of, you look at a little bit of everything. I was kind of thrust into business. There's certainly certain aspects of business that I'm not great with, that don't come very naturally, but the concepts of marketing and target marketing and things of that nature, pitches, entrepreneurship, those things ended up working out pretty well for me. So that's kind of how I ended up from
I love that story.
being a freshman in college to selling a practice.
I love that story, and I love how you leverage that marketing education where you got in front of your prospects, these professors, and you established trust with them, and that was sort of your approach versus the dialing and smiling approach or the door to door sales, which I think that's the way. When you're a financial advisor, you're leveraging your network, and it's one phone call at a time to sort of present yourself as someone that can manage their finances. And I love the fact that it makes a lot of sense how you took your marketing education into that field and really built a fantastic portfolio. Why did you sell?
Well, this is kind of where things kind of go a little bit full circle. So I sold because I saw a TEDx talk. I saw a
Wow.
TEDx talk. I was going along the path of the financial advisor. Once you hit, you know, I sold my practice in 2012. Started
Mm,
in 1999. The path of the financial advisor, unless you're expanding, is pretty linear. Like, I was working with clients on an annual basis, checking out the portfolio, seeing what they needed, collecting annual fees. And at some point in time, I felt like I was kind of a cog in the machine. There was nothing really special about what I was doing. Uh, and so I saw a TEDx talk by a man named Sir Ken Robinson called "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" which is the single most watched TEDx talk of all time. And he talked a lot about how school systems are based on the Industrial Revolution. So if you imagine the General Motors production line with the conveyor belt, for the most part, like we put kids on a conveyor belt, we pour information in their head, and they either check out at the end, and we put them into college, and they are put there to become great employees for a large company. They kind of check out, and in that case, we might put them into blue collar work,
Hmm.
or they don't check out. And in that case, we put them into the military. And so he had this way of talking about this duality between the Industrial Revolution and education that really resonated with me and really stuck with me.
Hmm.
And stuck with me to the level that I was looking at what I was doing with work, which, I was running my own practice. I was my own boss, had all the time in the world to do whatever I wanted to do. But I felt as though if, someone looked down at the state of Delaware and said, is Dan Young the best financial advisor here? I don't know if anyone would say yes, or I don't know if they could say yes, that I was doing enough or setting or was special enough, unique enough where you could say that. Now, I did feel as though if someone looked down and said, could Dan Young be the best educator in state of Delaware? I thought to myself, I could do that.
Hmm.
I definitely could be that. Um, and so within months, I sold my practice because I felt as though this was not um, it was great, and I loved the relationship with the clients, but I felt it wasn't it. And I felt some form of education working with students was it. And that really led to this. It's once again, it's kind of part of that renaissance after my grandfather passed, where I was just looking at something I knew my parents would think I was like insane for doing it. And then obviously, if you look down at the full timeline to sell out, in 2012, it would have been way better to do it like 20, like 15 or 16. But I just felt it in my gut that I was being told that you need to be teaching people something.
Hmm.
And once I went full out, finished up, my PhD was finished that year. I was in there mainly because I really felt like I told my grandfather to get a PhD. Um, and that was just kind of the year that I finished up. I was ready to start teaching, and that led to a really cool, rise for 12 years of just being a full. Before that, I was an adjunct professor, but being kind of a full-time professor, full-time administrator at a number of different schools in a number of different roles. So it just definitely for me, it was the right move, and it was a lot of it. Sometimes you just get some level of divine intervention that says this is the
Hmm.
move for you.
Wow. That's pretty remarkable. I think about a legacy and how, people kind of go through their life, and it's sometimes it's so late in their lives, and it gets to, people are in their 50s or even their 60s when they, something, it could even be an illness of some sorts, or some, like in some cases it was COVID 2 years ago, where people, it's almost like they wake up and they're like, wait a second, what I'm doing today isn't the legacy that I want to leave behind. And it's so interesting how it was your first job and it was a TEDx talk that made that impact, that inspired you to make a choice, make a bold choice to make a change and go into a completely different direction. So kudos for not just watching the TED talk, but acting on it. I think a lot of times people absorb content and they watch inspiring videos, or and they start to think about how I could do this or I want to do this. But sometimes that voice that you play, that's maybe an insecurity, that keeps people from leaning into that and making that choice, and they just continue on doing what they do and they ignore that voice. But you didn't ignore it. You actually leaned into it and you acted on it. I think that's fantastic.
Well, I mean, it's scary, right? So, I mean, it's one of those things that, at that point in time, I had two kids, and so it was. I think at the end of the day, when I talked about my sons and whatever path they go on or what have you, at the end of the day, you only get, not to make this the cliche hour, but you only get one life,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, if you have good friends, if you have good family, um, and you're moderately intelligent, you'll be okay. You might not be like a seven-figure person, but you're going to be okay. So there's very, very little to lose actually
Mm,
in just kind of going for it if you have people who love and support you.
right.
So I think it's at some point in time I had to remind myself of that and not put myself up against an unreachable standard of what I needed to be. And also, in essence, the thing I tell my kids, like, it's at the end of it, you just need to be happy. Like, that's if you're happy, everything else works itself out, really.
Mm,
So I think that it was probably some people would consider a gutsy move, but at the time, if I didn't make the move, I would have just sat there day over day, just regretting not making the move.
mm. I love that. So many people live in regret, and you made the choice. And so I'm looking at your profile today, your storefront online, and it's brand amplifier, it's fractional CMO, founder, investor, educator, catalyzer. And I want to fast forward to the work that you're doing today. And there's a lot. I mean, I can't believe like how much time is in a day. How do you get all the things that you're getting done? And now you're launching a nonprofit that I want to hear about. And so, tell us about what you're like in terms of the time that you're spending as an educator and as an entrepreneur, as a fractional chief marketing officer. How are you splitting your time, and what keeps you busy and what keeps you inspired?
Well, I think that I'll start with the last one and then go to the first one. The
Okay.
major thing that keeps me inspired is just this concept that I try to help anybody who's kind of living in obscurity move out of obscurity, right? So there's these four different areas that you hit. Like, every business person, every company, every speaker, they start out in obscurity and no one knows who you are. People are trying to figure out like how to compare you to some other person. So if you're living in obscurity, like, someone's like, oh, this offering sounds good, let me vet this with the 12 other people I found online who do that, right?
Hmm.
Eventually, your brand starts to take off, and then you go from obscurity to resistance, where people are using you as a reason to do business with them. It's like, oh, don't go on Raymond's podcast because everyone knows Raymond's podcast is this, but mine is this, which is actually a positive, right? You
Hmm.
can't, Coca-Cola only got stronger when Pepsi came, not weaker. Because Pepsi kept referring to Coca-Cola, and then everyone drank more soda, and which has its own health issues.
Mm,
Um, so you kind of go from obscurity to resistance to acceptance, as this is the brand standard. So now all these great speakers are on Raymond's platform. Now it's acceptance that this is the best podcast, and then you go from acceptance to adoration, right? So those of us who've played any sort of high school sports, we all start out in high school JV football in obscurity. Then we get really good with the best person of our team, and then now we're being compared on the college level, and there's resistance. Like, we want to pick this person over this person. Then you get drafted into the NFL, and then there's acceptance. Like, you got to the NFL, no one can question whether or not you're a good player or not. And eventually you get to levels like the Tom Brady's, the Walter Paytons, the Dan Marinos, like, all these people who are in the level of adoration, where there's no doubt you are the greatest of the greatest. But all that starts with an initial amplification of your brand doing something, right? And so a lot of what I do does not take more than an hour or two a week. It's really just helping people take their stories and turn their stories into ideas. And this is kind of like Ted's framework, right? Turn their stories into ideas instead of just telling your story, and then turn those ideas into ideas that change everything, that really sit with the end user, and they can attribute their own feelings and emotions to the idea. It's very hard for me to attribute my feelings and emotions to your story, because no matter what, if you're telling me your story, then I'm like, wow, I feel bad for Raymond, or I feel happy for Raymond, or I'm sorry Raymond went through that.
Hmm.
So that's not going to sit in someone's mind very long. But if you create an idea around it, then people can attribute their own feelings and emotions to that idea based on something that's happened to their life, and then that's the stickiness that happens, right? It's like, being a Gen X man, you know, I think that, Batman Begins is one of the greatest movies of all time, right? And there's the great moment in the movie where Liam Neeson basically says to Christian Bale, it's like, in order, you want to have an impact. In order to have an impact, you have to be more than a man. You have to be an idea, because people can't kill ideas. Once you become an idea and they believe it, then you become a legend. So Batman's idea is vengeance, not billionaire in rubber suit.
Hmm.
And so most businesses, most people, most brands, they come to task with a story or some mission statement they created on ChatGPT, but they don't come with an idea. So usually what will happen is I can meet with someone, and the main way to amplify their brand is to take their mission or take their story, develop that into an idea, then move that to an idea that's worth sharing, and then move that idea worth sharing to an idea that changes everything. And then that's what everything in their arsenal is based on, that idea that changes everything. Most people just don't take the steps to do that. So it doesn't take too long to do that. And each of those different things listed there is probably an hour or two a week of my
Wow.
time. So it's really just, I've just created a basic system. One of the things I used to teach when I was at the University of Delaware is not necessarily like marketing management, but lifestyle management. Once you go to college, you need to figure out, hey, am I a 20-hour a week worker, or am I an 80-hour a week worker? Am I a super hard worker, or am I a super smart worker? Am I focused on like my own tactics, or am I focused on team building and leadership? That you that aside from your major, you need to understand, you need to think about what you want your lifestyle to look like. And I just eventually just said, hey, right now in my lifestyle, I don't necessarily want to work more than 20 hours a week, making up my basic expenses for daily life. So I created a system where all those are done in 20 hours a week. And then I can spend the other however much time I want talking about building teams and talking about increasing the value of assets that I have. And so while I might work a 40-hour week, only about 15 to 20 of those hours are actually there to actually pay all my bills. The rest is based on building assets and creating and checking with the team, if that makes sense.
Wow, that makes total sense. So, how do I get one of your hours per week? What you just said resonated with me on so many different levels. And this idea of getting to acceptance is just so impactful. And I love that framework. And I need to get on your calendar. I'd love to get on your
Well, I mean,
calendar.
see, I think so Raymond, like I think that's the great thing about this whole
Mm,
process is, then like when we were talking about setting up this call, you're like, so what works? I know you're busy. And it's like, well, I'm really not. so so tell it, and that's the beauty of
right.
it. You can spend the time doing the stuff you want to do. So
Mm.
it's not hard to get on my calendar. You obviously can shoot me an email at drdanyoung79@gmail.com, and we can always chat, because I think that, I firmly believe in an ability, whether I'm talking to a CEO, whether I'm talking to a kid in college, or I'm talking to someone in between. I always told students that being a college professor, especially in marketing, um, if when I'm Gen X and they're Gen Z, and obviously I have a lot of students now who are millennials because I've been teaching for a long time. I always say that being a college professor is the greatest hustle
Mm.
of all time, because every class I came out knowing more than they knew, by asking them questions of like, hey, what websites are you guys on? What apps are you guys on? Like what like how
Mm.
how do you make decisions about how to swipe right on Tinder versus swipe left? It's like, oh, this, and he had a puppy dog in the thing, and he was on a sailboat or whatever. And it's like, okay, so if you're the target market, I know exactly what to put in my advertising to you: puppy dogs and
Mm.
sailboats. Thank you. I'll make sure I share this with my clients. Appreciate that. So it was a great way to learn about people. And so even in our conversation we had last week, I learned a lot. And
Hmm.
so it's not hard to get an hour of my time, because it's also an hour of your
Right.
time.
I love that.
And I'm learning as much as you're
I love
learning.
that. So Dan, earlier you mentioned watching a TEDx talk that sort of inspired you to make a choice and make a pivot. And I'm looking in your background and I see TEDx Wilmington, and I can only assume that you have some involvement with the TEDx location there in Wilmington. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about your role there and in the work that you're doing.
Sure. So I'm the organizer of TEDx Wilmington. TEDx Wilmington has been around since 2012. We've grown to having over 800 speakers, and that includes TEDx Wilmington, TEDx Wilmington Salon, TEDx Wilmington Women, and TEDx Youth at Wilmington, which are all different ways that you can participate with
Mm.
TEDx. We've had over 70 million views of those videos on YouTube. So those don't include views on TED.com. And it's just become a really fun way to engage the audience here in the city of Wilmington, which, is when you look at TEDx platforms that have been around for more than 10 years, you're usually talking about TEDx Boston or TEDx St. Louis or TEDx Nashville or TEDx. Usually you're not talking about a city that only has about 40,000 people inside of the city limits of Wilmington, Delaware. And so I think we benefit from the fact that we are, right in the middle of Manhattan, Philadelphia,
Mm.
Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. And we benefit from just having a very consistent team that wants to do programming and wants to reach out and find speakers. And so our whole concept, you mentioned the nonprofit. The nonprofit is called Igniting Delaware's Edutainment Association, or IDEA. And so TEDx Wilmington is housed within IDEA. And it just helps us to raise more funds and to do more in our platform, because we're always looking to do more. And so the city of Wilmington, Delaware has just really embraced this concept of edutainment, groups of people getting together, learning together, having fun together all at the same
Mm.
time. And just the way the world works with everything from AI to streaming to video games to all these other things, we were finding it harder and harder to get people to come out of their house to actually be part of the community and interact with other people. And now it's getting better and better. Each year we get farther away from the onset of COVID. But this is something that the city of Wilmington, Delaware, has really kind of banded together to say we're really interested in these type of events where we can all learn together, network with each other, discuss ideas, create businesses together. It's been a really fun journey.
Yeah, I love that. And it sounds like being the organizer of TEDx also connects to the work that you're doing as a, in the marketing space. And I'm sure there's some connection there that you're able to benefit as well.
Well, I think mostly with TEDx events, organizers aren't able to profit off of those events individually.
Mm.
But of course, when you're out there and you're soliciting people for great ideas or great concepts, and you're meeting people, it's obviously an unbelievably great way to network with other people. And some of those people have become clients in some way, shape, or form. We don't necessarily push that for being organizers, but it just naturally happens by attrition. So the
Mm.
same way someone could listen to someone on a podcast and say, "Hey, maybe I want to reach out to that person," that certainly happens just from my participation.
I love that. So, Dan, I want to wrap up with a quote that I know you're familiar with. And I want to ask how this quote connects with you. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader?
Yeah, I know that one. Yeah,
I know you know that one.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I think, that's John Adams.
Yep.
And I think that I I believe that. I think one of the interesting things, I always use the analogy, being a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder who kind of grew up around the 90s. There was a famous um, newscast where Donovan McNabb, who's a great Eagles quarterback, said in an interview, it's like, listen, well, it's going to get done because I'm the leader. And then subsequently that year, one of his wide receivers, Terrell Owens, proved that maybe he wasn't the leader because everyone was kind of following what he was doing. I don't think you can ever actually call yourself a leader. Like, I would never be with a group of people and say, well, I'm the leader of this group. I think you can be the manager. I think you can be the organizer. I think you can be the supervisor. But I think someone else has to call you a leader based on being inspirational and being transformational. I think once people call themselves a leader, then it very much limits their ability to garner the respect that's necessary to really have everyone working at max capacity.
I love that. It's all about the actions, and in those actions and inspiring people to want to follow you. So, first of all, Dan, I can't believe it's already an hour.
That's been fun.
It's been a ton of fun. I'm so grateful that after 9 years, you and I met. We finally had that phone call, and I'm so looking forward to meeting in person here shortly. I know that we've talked about that, but thank you so much for, just giving us your time and sharing your story. It's so inspiring, and I know that listeners are going to walk away from this conversation with just so many nuggets, so much love, so much action to inspire themselves and others to really elevate themselves to the next level. So I appreciate you joining, and we're going to have your contact information in our notes. What is the best way, though, you'd want people? You mentioned your email earlier, but if someone wants to contact you, what's the best way they should do that?
Well, I mean, I'm absolutely fine with people contacting me via email. Just Dr. Dan Young 79, which is DrDanYoung 79 at gmail.com. Or feel free to text me or get me on WhatsApp at area code 302-528-7934.
Great. I don't think I've had anyone share their cell phone number before, and I'm sure you may get some text messages. So that's great.
Hey, listen, man, I'm not Paul McCartney. I don't expect like 5,000 people to like. So it's. I think
that's
it'll be
great.
All right.
I love that. Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Hello, Raymond again here. Thank you again to our sponsor, Career Minds, a global provider of outplacement and leadership development services. You can learn more about Career Minds at careerminds.com. And if you'd like to connect with me about your own personal career journey, you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well as on Instagram at raymondlee.co. Until next time, remember, if you're stuck or unsure of your career or future and think it's time for a change, ask yourself these 3 questions. Does my career or work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and for others? Until next time.